In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Laudetur Jesus et Maria, and a warm welcome back to all. This is a new episode of the Catechesis series dedicated to the theme of the crisis within the Church. I would like to point out at the outset, by way of introduction, this small but significant detail. This Catechesis series is not called the crisis of the Church because the Church herself never enters into crisis, or the Church as such. There is a crisis within the Church, that much is evident. But the Church herself cannot enter into crisis because the bride of Christ and the mystical body of Christ, as we saw last year, can never fall into crisis. She moves at a level far deeper than whatever occurs on the surface. Think of a stormy sea. We need not picture it that way, 40 meters below. I am keeping the figure conservative in that in the storm is as though it did not exist, yet we dwell on the surface, and so we must contend and do battle with this storm. While we wait for others to join the live stream, I remind those who wish and who find it worthwhile. I mentioned that the possibility of supporting this video, should you find it useful, formative, and important, through simple and costless gestures, such as, for example, a generous like and perhaps a subscription to the channel with the notification bell activated, the sharing of the video, or, this one takes a little more effort, so I will give you a bit more time for it, leaving a comment. All of these activities serve, as you know, to increase the reach of YouTube's algorithms and thus the video's capacity to spread widely. Those who wish to support my apostolate may do so through the viewing of the video or through a personal gesture by sustaining it with a free will offering, a one-time gift such as a super thanks, or ongoing ones such as a channel subscription. Last time we began to enter a little more into the substance of the matter. We studied and discussed somewhat the particular Bergoglio effect, as I chose to call it, because the previous pontificate played precisely the role of gatekeeper, that is, of a funnel drawing attention toward a series of evidently extraordinary events, striking ones, one might say. No, that much is beyond dispute. And yet, I repeat, by fixing one's gaze on particulars, one runs the risk of losing sight of the broader picture as a whole. In a previous episode, I cited one Archbishop Vigano because, within the course of my own, shall we say, personal process of questioning, seeking to inform myself, and therefore of studying what was taking place, he was the first to propose a vision of the broader perspective, one that went to the very roots. The problem we shall begin to address this evening, the episode is entitled The Second Vatican Council. I do not recall whether, last time or 2 episodes ago, among the bibliographical presentations that I displayed, I will show it now as I have it here before me because I must read from it. This very important text by De Mattei, and you can see what a substantial volume it is. It runs to a mere 600 pages of text, and then the full apparatus of notes besides. It is a work of scholarship. I cannot say how long Professor De Mattei devoted to it, to bring it to completion, because it has truly been something of a striking nature, yet it offers some rather significant insights for understanding. I would like now, so to speak, to cite, perhaps somewhat out of place, renowned and highly important passages of sacred scripture, yet there is a passage from Koheleth that says, and I feel bound in conscience to mention it, that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow, in the sense that sorrow is present before so many things that are phenomenological, that are phenomenologically visible, that cannot be ignored. Yet it grows all the more when one seeks to go and conduct an analysis of the causes, especially when those causes are deeply painful. I would like to offer a preliminary observation before beginning this episode, an important one. And it concerns our psychological reactions in the face of the situations before us. For example, with reference to the previous episode, casting all the responsibility for every ill of the Church upon a single person is a process that, however grave it may appear, for this is no ordinary person upon whom anger and criticism were being discharged, upon whom, so to speak, wrath and reproach were being heaped, is in certain respects a reassuring one. Why? Because if the problem were only one person, you know how they say it in Rome, one pope dies, another is made. And so, once the problem is resolved, yes, we will manage things for a time. It will then pass into oblivion, and more or less things will return to their proper place. If, on the other hand, as emerges from quite different and more thorough studies, and as we shall endeavor to see in the course of these, our conversations matters are not so simple, but unfortunately are far more complex, and therefore touch upon certain nodes, certain junctions, shall we say, archaic and deeply rooted ones, which today are so widespread and so metastasized that it is not conceivable. I do not wish to bear ill tidings, but it is not conceivable nor even imaginable that there could be an exit from this situation, at least as far as I can see by ordinary means. You might ask, then what use is knowledge? No, rather, what in fact is the use of knowledge? Knowledge is of use because we must protect ourselves, we must guard ourselves, and we must live within this reality without risking being overwhelmed by it, and without it, as St. Paul says, suffering shipwreck in the faith. You know, there is a celebrated saying of Padre Pio, which I have quoted many times, in which he said, "When these times come, that is the times of apostasy, I urge you above all else, the sacraments, the commandments, the catechism of always, and do all things in the faith of your fathers, in the faith of your fathers, in the faith of your fathers, and listen to no one else." He would say this. Now here we shall give an account of what he says. The problem is that our psyche, when it perceives even remotely that the problems could be very grave, immediately sets in motion a process of self-defense, because finding itself, and these are phenomena that occur within the space of a few instants, so to speak, incapable of bearing so great a stress, with all the dilemmas and with all the consequences and with all the problems it entails, it immediately turns toward the solution that is most difficult, most approachable, most reassuring. And not only that, it prepares for this solution the entire conceptual scaffolding needed to justify it. Understand that we always do this because we are human beings, and we must acknowledge that we are human beings, for better or for worse. None of us is content to enter into a situation of suffering because it is not a trivial matter. Not only physical suffering, but psychological as well, and moral as well. One has to consider. But if the troubles, as some would say, were to lie in the Second Vatican Council, well, that is an ecumenical council. Therefore, an ecumenical council can, so to speak, put forth things that do not hold up. And were that the case, it would be as though one were applying a patch. Who is in a position to do anything about it? And so if that were the case, everything that has been sought to be done in the aftermath, with every good intention, even with so many good things, could be tainted, and therefore a whole cascade of panic-inducing questions is unleashed that throws one into a state of panic. And so there arises the reassuring solution. No, all things considered, it was fine. All things considered, it was fine. It is simply a matter of seeking to have an overall vision, and therefore of offering a viable interpretation in line with the so-called hermeneutic of continuity. And so, yes, it is certainly true that the popes have had to do something about it afterward, yet they have also accomplished a great many good things. Yes, there have been certain deviations, but come now, let us try to reason through this a bit. I will say straight away, we are human beings. This is quite natural. We all tend to act this way. But as we know, even when we have some illness, the first thing we hope for is that it is nothing, is it not? Someone says, look, you really ought to have some tests done. You need to go and see a specialist, because what is the first thing we think? We hope there is nothing there. He tells you there is something. You hope he will tell you it is one thing, something that, all things considered, can be dealt with. The problem is when he has to tell you, and I say this with all earnestness, please, let us not make apotropaic gestures, arriving at a grave diagnosis, a grave one. That is to say, there is a tumor, it is there. The human reaction is that a person, how shall I put it, feels the blow of it, and a certain fear comes over him as well. And that too is entirely human. Because with a tumor, it is not a given that one comes through it. It is not a given that you will live to tell the tale. It is quite possible that one goes out horizontally. So all of this is perfectly normal. And yet, if there is a tumor, the only hope of doing anything about it is that it be diagnosed and diagnosed accurately, so that you can devise the defensive and offensive strategies to eradicate it. That is all. Let us then enter into the substance of this evening's episode, the Second Vatican Council. When I prepare these episodes, I find myself wanting to tear out hair I no longer have, because these texts before me would need to be read in their entirety. But consider reading 600 pages of a single document, not even if I were to. I always conduct these catechetical series as long, flowing courses. It would take a catechetical series of 150 episodes at the very least to comment upon this, and the important passages within it are numerous, so that one is inevitably compelled to synthesize. One must synthesize. Therefore, dear friends, I urge you, this catechetical series will be an attempt to offer, in the suggested reading guides, a measure of assistance. However, whoever wishes to form himself well must take time to study more deeply, because it is simply impossible otherwise. So then, the ancient antecedents, truly a synthesis so compressed that I am almost ashamed to present it as brief as it is, yet it must of necessity be so very well. First of all, we know that in the 1500s there had been the great Protestant crisis, to which the Council of Trent responded with Protestantism. There arose, among other things, among the many things, I mention only this one because it is relevant to our analysis, a particular manner of approaching the datum of revelation, that is, revelation itself, namely free examination, which means that I take the Bible very well, I read it for myself, and I interpret it without having any kind of guide or point of reference that might influence me, because Protestantism, among other things, denied the binding character I am summarizing in the extreme of the magisterium of the church. And so you take up your arguments, you do theology, as we would say today, and you draw out whatever seems fitting to you, and then naturally on this the theologians dispute among themselves. They contend with one another, never appealing to any authority, because there is none on this matter, but simply attempting to outmaneuver one another by arguing their own position more effectively. It is clear that this vision in the Catholic sphere is simply inconceivable. Why? Because theology is certainly done, that is, one inquires, one studies the revealed mystery which will never be adequately comprehended, but always with one eye fixed upon the light. And so those things that have been clarified and defined are not subject to free examination or to open discussion. That is, I cannot say I now wish to set myself to thinking about the Eucharist as though nothing had ever been said. I shall take up the texts and let us see what is meant by this. Is my body, is it truly something real, or is it not? Let us carry out a logical analysis. This could not be done within a Catholic framework. I am trying to simplify as much as possible on the historical level. Then immediately after the Reformation, which had moreover been philosophically presided over as that direct daughter of the first great rupture in traditional philosophical thought, classical and therefore scholastic and Thomistic, which was the true revolution of William of Ockham, who was practically the first to assert that reason, arbitrarily on its own initiative, approaches reality in a certain manner. So it is not that reason comes to know reality and comprehends it, and therefore takes note of what it is, and then works upon it, as it were. Rather, it is reason itself indeed, it is the will itself that arbitrarily exerts its influence upon reality. This is the so-called nominalism. That is to say, classical philosophy asks, why do I call that thing a glass? Because I perceive an object very well, whose function is to contain water, and I give it a name befitting the function it fulfills, based upon what it does. The nominalism of William of Ockham I am simplifying in order to speak to a broad audience. He says, no, I call that a glass. I could just as well have called it a tree. The fact that I called that a glass and called the tree a tree is simply an arbitrary choice. Do you understand? Therefore, the human mind is not capable of abstracting the essence and the concept of things. And so, the so-called philosophy of being, and rather it establishes it. It is the opposite. This process would have reached its full maturity with the thought of rationalism and with the philosophy of self-consciousness from Descartes onward, which would then gradually have flowed into the Enlightenment. An Enlightenment that became political reality, indeed an accomplished fact, with the French Revolution and its great principles of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Pay close attention to these three things: liberté, égalité, and fraternité, which were the mirror image, the direct opposite of what had been the principles of the Catholic monarchies. Catholics have a concept of liberty, but not the liberté of the Enlightenment thinkers. That is to say, I choose. There is no one who can tell me do this or do that. This is an objective good, this is an objective evil. I am the one who seeks it out and finds it for myself. I am free to do whatever I wish, with the sole limitation that my freedom must not encroach upon or infringe upon the rights of any other person. We hear these things today and we say, of course, that is how it is. No, it is not how it is. The gospel does not teach this. We are children of our own time, which derives from that very source, égalité. We are all equal. This as well. There are so many concepts that exist within Catholicism, but not in that sense. Yet the égalité of the French Revolution has today become the governing rule. Do you see? Consider, for example, the phenomenon of post-feminism. The foundational principle of feminism is not that man and woman possess equal dignity. No, it is that man and woman are identical, that there is no difference between them, and that therefore they are interchangeable. And woe to anyone who dares say otherwise. The Catholic faith has never taught any such thing. Fraternité. Certainly. There is a Catholic concept of fraternité. What is it? Pardon me. When we go to Mass, we are called brothers and sisters, are we not? And why? In what sense brothers and sisters? In the fullest, most profound sense of the word. Within a liturgical context, brothers and sisters, because we have been reborn in baptism and we have all become adoptive children of God, and therefore we are children of God, mind you, the baptized, and therefore we are brothers and sisters in the fullest sense, in the strict sense, whereas with other human beings, the concept of brotherhood is applied only analogically. Why? Because they are not all children of God in the full sense. in the strict sense, because they have not been baptized. But since we are all created by the Most High, we therefore share a factor, shall we say, in common, and therefore we are children of the same origin. Yet this does not mean a leveling out or an erasure of differences. Illuminism preaches cosmopolitanism. Since we are universal brothers, nations, geographical barriers, borders. No, the dream is to bring about a world where there are no longer states or borders. And where I am a citizen of the world that is cosmopolitanism, have you ever heard talk of a single world government? I have no wish to play the conspiracy theorist, mind you, and yet it all comes from there. Let us take the next step in the 19th century within a manifestly Protestant context. Something new came into being, the so-called liberal theology, that is to say, taking up the principles of liberalism. More or less those I have sketched out. I cannot be too technical or too precise, otherwise we would never finish, and bringing them into the theological sphere. And yet what happens is that certain Catholics begin to wink at this way of proceeding and begin to move along those frequencies. The magisterium of the Church intervenes clearly already with Pius IX, but above all with Leo XIII, and seeks to halt this kind of drift, imposing even at the level of theological studies what was subsequently historically called the so-called neo-scholasticism, thus a return, because it is always this, to the thought of Thomas Aquinas. Take note. However, from liberal theology a new movement begins to emerge. We must mention it briefly, known as modernism. What is this modernism? As the very term suggests, the idea that, take note, we began with liberal theology, that in some way the Church and her doctrine, I am simplifying, must modernize themselves. That is, they must, since the world has advanced so greatly and has developed under this great current of thought, liberal, enlightenment-based, the great democracies were already asserting themselves. The great democracies, the United States of America, had by now taken shape. This ferment was beginning. So to speak, we too must adapt, and therefore we must modernize ourselves, and therefore we must readjust the dogmas. We must re-express these things in a manner, how shall I put it, that is presentable to the man who is no longer the medieval man, no longer the archaic man, to whom you would foist the dogmas, things such as hell. All of this sort of thing I am simplifying for the sake of accessibility, even though it is in part clearly a scholarly treatment. I do wish, however, to convey these points. And against this, Pope Pius X reacted in the most forceful manner. Pope Pius X, with the encyclical Pascendi and the Lamentabili, condemning this current of thought as a hodgepodge that had gathered the very quintessence of this movement, fundamentally philosophical and cultural in nature, but also theological, which, if allowed to flourish, would have destroyed completely the Catholic faith. He defined it the synthesis and the repository of all heresies, and he sought to crush it by every means possible, imposing moreover upon all clerics of the Catholic Church, both at the time of ordination and upon assuming any public office whatsoever, the obligation of taking an oath against modernism, in which the fundamental principles of this vague and multiform and nebulous cauldron of Masonic thought and of network thinking was formally rejected. He dealt it a blow of no small consequence, except that the principle of the modernists was this: very well, we must hold our ground because, mark well, the principle of these people is to endure patiently, to remain within the Church, to bide their time, to continue seeking to move as circumstances permit, to reorganize, to circulate their ideas, and so forth, while waiting for the moment to arrive, the opportune moment. Our hour will come. And when our hour comes, we will change the Church from within, not from without. Take heed. That many of these, I do not know how many in good faith, believe that this kind of preparation is doing something properly and thoroughly. Great figures, such as those we shall also encounter this evening, used to say the Church from Constantine onward has completely changed its very nature. It became something altogether different in comparison with the mythic and legendary Church of the first centuries. The Church of the Apostles. Constantine arrives, it becomes the religion of the state, and so Christendom begins. And so it became something more triumphal, one that accordingly borrowed structures and ways of doing things from the Roman Empire, hence the Pope King and so forth. But all of these things here, and mark well that to this argument a great many people have fallen prey, and it has carried on right down to our own times. Now it is time to be done with it. We must work, because we must dismantle this monster that has been created, to set her apart from it, to free her from all of these things, of all these structures, of all this outdated legacy, and modernize it. I am simplifying to the utmost degree. I know many people learned and intelligent from the world of tradition, in the broad sense, whom I would not want to see frowning at such a sweeping simplification. Yet, in order to bring these matters to ordinary people, it being understood that there are texts for deeper study, I believe it is fitting to do so now. What happens? St. Pius X struck down the modernists, but his successors were somewhat weaker, perhaps because they thought that by that point the problem had passed, or perhaps for other reasons they did not exercise the same firm hand as St. Pius X. When Pius XIII arrived, Pius XIII at a certain point began to perceive, also because these men had begun to become university professors and thus to teach in Catholic theology faculties, and they began in the 1940s above all to bring a whole series of problems to the surface. One very serious case was that of Henri de Lubac with his article on the naturals, which practically maintained that human nature has a sort of right to receive the grace of God. I am simplifying the grace of God as we know from the teaching of the Church. Both that which we possess is by no means a right. It is a gift. Our human nature is disposed to receive it, but that is a gift. There is no right whatsoever. And observe how this way of thinking has made its way down to our own day, when one hears it said that we have a right to mercy. Since when? Clearly this position was swiftly condemned by the Church. In any case, there were taking shape in those decades, between the 1930s and the 1960s of the last century, a number of Catholic thinkers, chiefly Dominicans and Jesuits, but also outside that context. For instance, Joseph Ratzinger, as we shall have occasion to see, was neither a Dominican nor a Jesuit. He was a diocesan priest, but he was a theologian, which were catalogued, since many of these came from France, under the name of Nouvelle Théologie. The new theology, a new theology which fundamentally embraced all the claims of liberalism, of modernism, causing an extremely powerful shift away from what had always been classical theology, fundamentally theocentric. As the very name indicates, theology has at its center discourse about God, does it not? There came about the so-called anthropological turn, that is, attention is shifted away from God toward man, but to shift attention from God to man is nothing other than what was done by the Enlightenment thinkers and the Freemasons. It is one and the very same thing, that is to say, Freemasonry, which many people imagine to be some mysterious and inscrutable thing. What does it actually promote? The cult of man, man as a worthy being, man as an end unto himself, man, the brother of all man, who possesses a dignity, an absolute dignity, the free man, the democratic man, the man who is self-determining, the man who also holds certain things he believes in, provided he does not impose them on others and respects the opinions of his neighbor. To put it simply, you see, this is at a certain point Pius XV perceived that this man was becoming rather dangerous, and so in 1950 he wrote an encyclical, his last one, the Humani Generis, a condemnation of modernism and of the Nouvelle Theology even there. However, unfortunately, there was a certain small, very small concession to certain things. I remember it well, for example, that in the field of exegesis, with regard to the study of sacred scripture in the 20th century, there was a certain Rudolf Bultmann, and thus the analysis, the rationalistic exegesis, that is to say, based on the historical literary methods which approach biblical literature in a fundamentally reductive way, as though it were a literary work identical to any other work in the history of literature, and thus applying the same exegetical and hermeneutical criteria, identical to those one would apply, for instance, to a text of law. But this is not possible. It is simply not possible. And yet the Protestant world, this had become a mantra, and Catholic exegetes, rather than pushing back, began to feel intellectually inferior, and therefore to think that they too ought to proceed in the same manner, because otherwise, and so they engaged in so-called scientific exegesis. You are aware that in the meantime there had arisen the whole problem of modern science, the claim that we possess science while you merely deal in idle talk. So there was this entire context at work, and therefore indeed he intervenes, but leaves a few small openings. There were certain figures whom Pius XIII sought to set aside as well. We shall address this when the occasion arises, especially when we take up the question of faults within the Church and frank words concerning the Church, the case of the one who would become Paul VI, who had been a man within the Roman Curia. At a certain point, Pius X, perceiving certain things, sent him to serve as Archbishop of Milan without naming him a cardinal. And so upon the death of Pius X, Montini was not elected Pope because he was not a cardinal. The problem is that as soon as Roncalli was elected, he named him a cardinal, and so as soon as Roncalli had died, Montini entered the conclave already as Pope, and emerged as Pope. To give some sense of why, now what happens is this: Pius XIII dies, and this man is elected, this Cardinal Angelo Roncalli, who was, in a word, I shall read you something presently to understand a little who he was, given a life that was somewhat certainly, shall we say, remarkable. So then let me read you something. The Cardinal, here I begin to read from the text of Tite Mattei, Cardinal Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, born at Sotto il Monte on the 25th of October 1881. Here we must now begin to make evident the Pope who had convened the council and from a family of peasant origins had led a troubled life. the suspicion of modernism, let us note this straight away. He had also maintained his relations with Ernesto Buonaiuti, Don Ernesto Buonaiuti, later excommunicated, a leading figure of Italian modernism, unanimously recognized as such. There is therefore no need to spend time on that. If you search online, look up Don Ernesto Buonaiuti, and you will see him from above on the 10th of August 1904 in the Church of Santa Maria in Montesanto. Take note, his ordination by his fellow seminarian Buonaiuti in the seminary, so this is no legend. John Veritrain was a friend of Buonaiuti. Who says so? He assisted him on the day of his priestly ordination. What do you mean, who says so? It is beyond doubt, and he had not been insensible, Roncalli, to the claims of modernism while not intending, this is a quotation drawn from the Journal of a Soul, to venture propositions even by so much as a hair's breadth, contrary to the right thinking of the Church. So Roncalli, friend of this man, what could this modernism be? Was somewhat attracted to it, yet what he wrote, at least in the beginning, was yes. But I wish to remain faithful to Holy Mother Church, to the right thinking of the Church. After his priestly ordination, he was called back to Bergamo as secretary to the new bishop, Monsignor Giacomo Radini Tedeschi, himself also open to the influences of modernism. Cardinal Gaetano Delay having come to learn of the fact that on a certain occasion the young Roncalli had shown himself inclined toward that current of broad ideas which tends to empty out the value of traditions, and the authority of the past had exhorted him to free himself from the unfortunate enchantment of certain books and certain authors. This too appears in quotation marks in italics, with a footnote, therefore a document in the Trench archives and so forth. So the important thing about these studies is that they do not deal in idle talk. They cite sources very well, which is of the utmost importance for conducting objective analyses like his bishop, Radini Tedeschi Roncalli, while not being entirely a stranger to a modernist movement. Take note here again, there is another footnote, and here he did nonetheless dissent, at least in private, from the anti-modernist stance of St. Pius X. Therefore, in private, he did not share the concerned and anti-modernist attitude of St. Pius X, in short, after which Roncalli he was called to work in Rome at Propaganda Fide, and in 1925, therefore, at the rather young age of 44 years, he was consecrated a bishop and appointed apostolic visitor to Bulgaria, one of the least prominent posts in Vatican diplomacy. Very well, he then continued his diplomatic career in Turkey, then as nuncio in France. And at a certain point the nunciature of Paris opened the way for him to the Sacred College, and Roncalli was created a cardinal in 1953 and was assigned at the age of 72 to the Patriarchal See of Venice. He became the Patriarch of Venice, the very see that had been governed by St. Pius X before his ascent to the pontifical throne. The distinguishing mark of his 5 years of governing the diocese, that is, from 1953 to 1958, was a pastoral style marked by optimism toward the present age and in the face of the spectre of the triumph of atheistic Marxism and materialism, as he confirmed in the pastoral letter for Lent of 1955. Now pay close attention to a passage which, whether they are the ideas of Roberto de Mattei agreeable or not, yet it is important to keep them in mind. The figure of Angelo Roncalli remains still, in a certain respect, a mystery one could not attribute to the Patriarch of Venice, who was ascending to the pontifical throne, either a progressive or a conservative vision such as those that were taking shape with clarity on the threshold of the 1960s, terms that previously had had no reason to exist. And so this terminology begins to emerge in the 1960s, when there were innovators who were called progressives and those who stood against them who were called conservatives. Clearly his religious sensibility made of him a conservative, yet his attentiveness to, in quotation marks, humanity drove him toward gestures of rupture with tradition and toward novelties of a pastoral order. The revolutionary character of his pontificate is to be sought less in his ideology than in his manner of being in an earthly humanity. Even though, as Meloni observes, the human dimension of Roncalli has nothing whatsoever in common with its pastoral byproducts, or even its poeticizing offshoots running through to the late 20th century, Roncalli from as early as the 1930s would never tire of maintaining that it is necessary to adapt the forms of effective penetration to the circumstances of the times and places. The idea that one could free oneself from the ancient forms without distorting the substance of the doctrine, this was precisely an idea of Roncalli's. Let us understand clearly that this is exactly what he would have asked to be done at the council, which at a certain point he convoked. When was the first time that he spoke of this council? The date is January 25th, 1959, so not long after he had been elected to the throne of Peter, always St. Paul. Outside the walls, the setting as well. More recently, of other similar events he announced on that date. 3 intentions: the convocation of a synod for the Diocese of Rome, which until that moment had been practically neglected by the popes, because it was entirely distinct from the reality of the Holy See. Then the revision of the code, and third, the intention to convoke a general ecumenical council. Now, a thing of that kind in that context, still anything but tranquil, but marked by the ferments of the Nouvelle Theologie, could seem an imprudent undertaking, and it was by more than a few a date pay attention, because there is then an episode very, very important between this date and then the formal discourse of convocation at the solemn opening of the council, which would take place with the address of October 11th, 1962. I believe everyone will know that there was the problem of the famous third secret of Fatima. Now we shall not go into detail, but it is a matter of fact that Our Lady had made it known that that portion of the secret which had not been revealed was to be transmitted to the Pope and made public in 1960. I shall read something on this matter. The world was passing through a difficult hour of history. The announcement of John XXIII of his desire to gather the bishops of the world in a council had been preceded by just a few weeks by the entry of Fidel Castro's forces into Havana. The Cuban Revolution had confirmed the existence of a plan for worldwide expansion of communist imperialism. Less than 3 years later, with the international crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union, following the Kremlin's decision to install its missiles in Cuba, the world would find itself on the brink of nuclear war to those who professed an unwarranted optimism regarding the course of historical events. The message of Fatima recalled the tragedy of the moment and pointed out the path for confronting it, even those parts already known of the so-called secrets of Fatima, for whoever wished, according to the reading of the text, did not, however, move John XXIII, who confined himself to dictating to his secretary, Monsignor Capovilla, a note attesting that the Pope had taken cognizance of the content and was leaving to others, to his successor, the responsibility of rendering a judgment. Father Alonso, the foremost expert on Fatima, who learned of it most probably from one of those present at Castel Gandolfo, recounts that, after reading the message, the Pope remarked, "This does not concern the years of my pontificate. The directive of the ecclesiastical authority was that transmitted by Father Giovanni Caprilla in Civiltà Cattolica, no terrors, no alarmism, no sensationalism, no morbid curiosity. His Pope Roncalli judged it proper to defer the publication of the text are evident." Which ones? There was a glaring contrast between the prophetic message of doom in the message of Fatima and the optimistic prophetism of the new pontiff who was inaugurating the Second Vatican Council. That is to say, the historical backdrop presented a political situation that was dramatically grave on the international stage. Communism, which, as Our Lady said at Fatima, "If you do not consecrate Russia to my Immaculate Heart, communism will spread its errors throughout the world." We have the Soviet Union, China, and now Cuba is coming as well. Within the Church there is a situation of agitation and unrest on account of the heretical ferments of the innovators from the standpoint of theology. Very well. And who was Roncalli? An optimist, a peaceable man. The celebrated "Bring a caress to your children and tell her it is sent to her by the Pope," do you understand? The taking up of sentiments, a perspective that had no, so to speak, foundation in reality. How could one be optimistic in the face of a situation of this kind? There is no reason for optimism unless you simply want an optimistic discourse because you have decided to be optimistic by sheer force of will. So there was a genuine contrast between these two lines. And take note, in the opening address of the Council, Roncalli let this thing slip out because he said it, let us go and read it. I will show it to you. Just a glimpse of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. Holy Mother Church rejoices because by a special gift of divine providence, the long-desired day has at last dawned, on which here at the tomb of St. Peter, under the auspices of the Virgin Mother of God, you know that on the 11th of October in the old calendar, it was the feast of the divine maternity of Mary, whose maternal dignity is today celebrated with joy. The Second Vatican Ecumenical Council solemnly begins all the councils, both the 20 ecumenical councils, and not to be underestimated, the provincial and regional councils that have been celebrated over the course of 7 centuries bear witness with great clarity to the vitality of the Catholic Church, and have inscribed themselves as resplendent figures in her history. In convening this magnificent assembly, the most recent and most humble successor of the Prince of the Apostles, who is speaking to you, has set before himself the purpose of reaffirming once more the ecclesiastical magisterium which never fails and endures until the end of time, a magisterium which, through this council, presents itself in an extraordinary manner to all men who are in the world, taking into account the deviations, the needs, and the opportunities of the present age. As this universal council begins, the vicar vicar of Christ who is speaking to you looks, as is natural, toward the past, and seems almost to hear its voice urging and encouraging him, for he gladly turns his thoughts to the meritorious service of the Supreme Pontiffs who lived in earlier and in more recent times, and who, from the assembly of councils held in the East and in the West from the 4th century through the Middle Ages, have in latter times transmitted their testimonies of what is great and solemn, and who cry out without ceasing in triumph for this society, both human and divine, that is, for the Church, which receives from the divine Redeemer his name, the gifts of grace, and the whole of her mission. If this is a cause for spiritual rejoicing, pay close attention here. We cannot nonetheless deny that in the long succession of 19 centuries, many sorrows and many bitter trials have overshadowed this history. And here there are a series of citations of gospel passages. No, from Simeon, he who hears him hears me, he who is not with me is against me, after nearly 20 centuries. The situations and the problems of the gravest kind that humanity must face do not change, for Christ always occupies the central place in the history of life they call upon the Church, and so forth. Yet let us proceed to examine the paragraphs that are of greatest interest to us as regards the origin and the cause of the great event for which the decision to convene you was made. It suffices to recall once more the testimony, certainly humble, yet one which we are able to attest as something personally experienced the first time we conceived this council. It came to us, as it were, quite suddenly, and shortly thereafter we communicated it in simple words before the Sacred College of Cardinal Fathers in that place, on the 25th of January 1959, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, in his patriarchal basilica on the Via Ostiense. The hearts of those present were at once and suddenly moved, as though a ray of supernatural light had shone forth, and all gave expression to it in the brightness of their eyes. At the same time there was kindled throughout the entire world an immense interest, and all men began to await with eager expectation the celebration of the council. My friends, do you see that which, as was said before, humanity, and what is this sentiment that is, I spoke about this matter, everyone was moved, tears welling in their eyes, and so this thing is to be done during the course of events entirely different from an objective point of view, or am I mistaken? Do you see the danger of sentimentalism even at the highest levels? Let us continue in these 3 years. An intense labor has been carried out to prepare the council, and so forth, illumined by the light of this council, the Church will grow, as we hope, in spiritual riches, and drawing from it the vigor of new energies, she will look with confidence upon the times to come, indeed, by introducing timely amendments and wisely setting in motion a commitment of inquiry and assistance. The Church will bring it about that men, families, and nations truly turn their minds toward supernatural reality. Take note, here we find the very quintessence of the problem. Now then, there is moreover another matter which it is useful to set before you, drawn from your own reflection on the subject, that it may not escape our notice. Permit us to observe before this magnificent assembly that the opening of this ecumenical council falls at a most favorable moment in time, for often as we have ourselves experienced in the exercise of our daily apostolic ministry. It comes to pass that not without pain to our ears there are brought to our attention the voices of certain persons who, though burning with zeal for religion, yet judge matters without sufficient objectivity or prudent discernment. Mark this well. In the present condition of human society, they are capable of seeing nothing but ruin and calamity. They go about saying that our times, when compared with ages past, are altogether worse, and they go so far as to behave as though they had nothing to learn from history, which is the teacher of life, as though in the time of the earlier councils all had proceeded smoothly with regard to Christian doctrine and the liberty of the Church. And now pay close attention. It is our mind that we must resolutely disagree with these prophets of doom, who announce nothing but catastrophe, as though the end were almost upon us in the present state of affairs of human events in which humanity seems to be entering. And pay attention into a new order of things. Pay careful attention to that phrase, another term, a new order of things. What are rather to be discerned are the mysterious designs of divine providence, which are fulfilled in successive ages through the work of men, and often beyond their own expectations and awareness, all of this too responding to various approaches directed toward the good of the Church. End of citations, friends. And so we must draw nearly to the close of this episode. It could not be more clear than this. Those who go about issuing warnings, not because they wish to play the prophet of doom, but on the basis of objective and real circumstances, and who therefore speak of the dangers looming over the human race and over the Church herself, are catalogued as birds of ill omen, prophets of doom. We seem to hear it said resolutely, therefore onward, press forward. The secret of Fatima does not concern us. The prophets of doom, we shall leave them behind and do this thing with the purpose of updating the Church. Further on, and we conclude here, it is He says, opening the Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, it is more evident than ever that the truth of the Lord endures forever, for we see in the succession of one age after another, that men contend with one another and often vanish as soon as they have arisen like mist dispersed by the sun. In short, in any case, there is no time in which the Church has not opposed these errors. She has often condemned them as well, and sometimes with the utmost severity. Here is the other key passage. As regards the present time, the spouse of Christ prefers to make use of the medicine of mercy. She believes that one must go to meet the needs of today by setting forth more clearly the value of her teaching rather than by condemning. Take note, not because there is no shortage of false doctrines, opinions, and dangers to be guarded against and opposed, but because all of them are so openly at variance with right principles of moral rectitude and have produced fruits so deadly so. Listen carefully, they seem to begin of their own accord to condemn themselves, especially those ways of life that disregard and despise her laws, placing too much trust in the progress of technology, grounding human well-being solely in the communities of life. And so therefore in this council no condemnations of anything would be issued. A style would be observed that was purely propositional. Is that clear? Why? Because they would go away on their own, because it is so evident that these errors are so deadly that they would disappear of their own accord. But then, in other words, one hardly needs infused knowledge in order to understand that these things have been utterly and desperately refuted by the fact's errors. If they are not condemned and resolutely combated, do not simply disappear on their own. Not in the least, unfortunately. And so you see this anticipation of Reaganite optimism, as it was called when I was young, in the 1980s, was simply ruinous and disastrous. And there is that sinister expression of the new order of things. You must know that at the death of Pope Roncalli there occurred, unfortunately, something that had never before recorded. I will show it to you as a superimposition which reads as follows, and we close. So then, on the occasion of the death of John XXIII, on the 3rd of June 1963, Mexican Freemasonry purchased a space in the daily newspaper El Informador on the 4th of June 1963 to express its mourning. Our translation appears alongside every commentary is superfluous. Very well, the Grand Western Lodge of Mexico of Free and Accepted Masons, on the occasion of the passing of Pope John XXIII, makes public its grief at the disappearance of this great man who came to revolutionize the ideas, the thinking, and the ways of acting of the Roman Catholic liturgy. The encyclical Mater et Magistra and Pacem in Terris has revolutionized the concepts in favor of the rights of man and his freedom. Humanity has lost a great man, and the Masons, they recognize in him his lofty principles in humanitarianism, with the standing of a great liberal with that of the face. Mexico, June 3rd of 1963, Grand Western Lodge of Mexico. Let us translate the Grand Western Lodge of Mexico of Freemasons and Accepted, on the occasion of the death of Pope John XXIII, makes public the principles of the Catholic liturgy. Roman, the encyclical Mater et Magistra and Pacem in Terris, has revolutionized the concepts in favor of the rights of man, the United Nations, and his freedom. Humanity has lost a great man, and the Masons recognize in him his humanitarianism and his standing as a great liberal. This is not legend. This is not conspiracy theory. This is history. One must comment on this. One must comment on this. Before seeing this, I am not aware. If someone is not aware, please do let me know of a precedent from the 23rd. But this would have occurred with the death of Paul VI, also with the death of Paul VI, and also not so much with the death, but with the election to the throne of Peter, of Pope Francis, public declarations of enthusiastic Freemasons. What must one think? I am showing documents. I am doing absolutely nothing else. What are we to think of these things? That is the question. And in the light of how we find the Church today, and of how we shall see her to have been transformed through the Council, and by principles the Council made its own, because, as we shall see, liberty, equality, and fraternity found in the Second Vatican Council their ecclesial expression and their habitat within the Catholic Church, so much so that Cardinal Suenens, as we shall see, was able to say that the Second Vatican Council was the 1789 of the Church. Clearly, this subject is not exhausted in a single episode. We shall take it up again from this point and discuss it, God willing, next time. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Laudetur Jesus et Maria. Semper laudetur.